There's a power most men never discover, because they're too busy talking. They think dominance comes from having the right words, the perfect comeback, the clever line that makes her laugh, or the deep conversation that makes her feel seen. So they rehearse, they explain, they justify their worth through sentences, through paragraphs, through entire monologues about who they are and why they matter. And while they're speaking, something invisible is happening. She's not listening to the words. She's reading the energy beneath them, the need in your voice, the desperation in your explanations, the way you fill silence like it's a threat instead of a throne. And in that moment, without either of you realizing it, the power shifts. Not because of what you said, but because you needed to say it at all. Nietzsche understood something most men spend their entire lives missing. True dominance has nothing to do with speech. It's not about what you say or how you say it. It's about the unshakable presence you carry when you say nothing at all. It's about the man who can sit in a room, completely still, while chaos swirls around him, and everyone, especially her, feels the weight of his existence without him uttering a single syllable. That's not control. That's sovereignty. And sovereignty doesn't announce itself. It simply is. Here's what men get wrong about power dynamics with women. They think it's about dominance in the traditional sense. Being louder, stronger, more aggressive, more certain. They think if they can just out-argue her, out-reason her, prove their point with logic and facts, they'll win. So they engage. They debate. They try to convince her of their value, their perspective, their truth. But here's the brutal reality. The moment you feel the need to convince her of anything, you've already lost. Because convincing is the language of the powerless. It's what you do when you're beneath someone, when you need their approval, when their opinion of you matters more than your opinion of yourself. A king doesn't convince peasants he's a king. He doesn't argue for respect. He doesn't justify his throne. He simply sits on it, and everyone in the kingdom understands exactly where they stand. Nietzsche saw this pattern everywhere. Men performing masculinity instead of embodying it. Men seeking validation instead of generating it from within. Men negotiating their worth instead of standing firmly in it without explanation. And he realized that every word a man speaks in defense of himself is a confession that he doubts his own value, a confession that he needs external confirmation, a confession that he can be moved, manipulated, controlled by the mere threat of disapproval. That confession is what she hears beneath every explanation. Not your logic, not your reasoning, your need, and need to a woman is repulsive. Not because women are cruel, but because attraction is biological. And biology doesn't respond to desperation. It responds to certainty, to groundedness, to the man who exists fully in his own frame, completely unmoved by her tests, her provocations, her emotional storms. The man who can look at chaos and not flinch. The man who can hear her words and choose silence, not as a strategy, but as a refusal to descend into reactivity. That man becomes magnetic, not because he's trying to be, but because he's stopped trying altogether. Let me be real with you. Every man has been that guy at some point, the one who over-explained, the one who sent the long text message defending his character, the one who stayed up late arguing about respect, about fairness, about why she shouldn't have said what she said or done what she did, the one who felt like if he could just make her understand, everything would be okay. You remember those moments, the tightness in your chest, the rehearsed sentences running through your mind, the way you kept checking your phone, waiting for her response, hoping your words landed the way you intended, the relief when she finally replied, the devastation when she dismissed everything you said with a single sentence, or worse, said nothing at all. And here's the part that breaks men. None of that mattered. Not the carefully chosen words, not the vulnerability you showed, not the time you spent trying to make her see your side. Because she wasn't evaluating your words, she was evaluating your energy. And your energy told her everything she needed to know. You were movable, shakeable, controllable through the simple act of withholding approval. That's not a partnership, that's a power imbalance. And the cruelest truth is this: she didn't create it, you did. The moment you needed her to understand, You handed her the reins. Nietzsche wrote, "The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die. As well the minds which are prevented from changing their opinions, they cease to be mind. But most men never shed the skin of needing to be understood. They carry it into every relationship, every argument, every moment of tension. They mistake being understood for being loved. They mistake explaining themselves for standing in their truth. But understanding is not love, and explanation is not strength. Real strength is the man who can be misunderstood and not lose a single hour of sleep over it, who can be accused and not scramble to defend, who can be tested and not react, because he knows something most men never learn. Her opinion of him is not his responsibility. His integrity is. His boundaries are. His peace is. And a man who protects those things without apology becomes untouchable. Here's something men rarely understand. Women test you constantly, not out of malice, not to hurt you, but because they need to know if you're solid, if your frame is real or performed. If you can hold your ground when pressure comes, or if you'll fold the moment things get uncomfortable. So she'll push, she'll say something inflammatory, she'll withdraw affection, she'll manufacture conflict out of nowhere just to see how you respond. And most men fail this test immediately because they don't even realize it's happening. They think the test is about the surface issue, the thing she's upset about, the accusation she's making, the drama she's creating. So they address the surface, they explain why she's wrong, they try to fix the problem, they seek resolution, but the test was never about the issue. The test was about your reaction. She doesn't care if you can win the argument, she cares if you can remain unshaken while she creates the storm. She doesn't care if you can prove you're right, she cares if you need to. She doesn't care if you can defend yourself with words. She cares if you feel the need to defend yourself at all. And when you stay silent, truly silent, not the passive-aggressive kind, not the cold shoulder punishment, but the calm, centered, utterly unbothered silence of a man who has nothing to prove. Something shifts in her perception of you. Because in that silence, she confronts something terrifying. You're not playing her game. You're not dancing to her rhythm. You're not reacting to her provocations. You're simply existing in your own frame, completely indifferent to her attempts to pull you out of it. That indifference, that refusal to be moved, is the most attractive force a man can possess. Not because it's cold, but because it's complete. It says, without words, I am not negotiating my value with you. I am not debating my worth. I know who I am, and your approval or disapproval changes nothing. And when she realizes that, when she understands that her emotional weapons don't work on you, everything changes. Not because you dominated her, but because you dominated yourself. But there's another reason, a deeper one, why silence is so powerful. Most men don't realize this, but women communicate primarily through subtext, through energy, through what's not being said. They read tone, body language, micro-expressions, the space between your words. While men are focused on content, women are focused on context. While men are listening to what's being said, women are feeling what's beneath it. And when you speak, when you explain, defend, justify, you're giving her a massive amount of data to work with. She's analyzing your word choice, your tone, your pacing, the emotions leaking through your carefully constructed sentences. And she's using all of that to map your internal state, to find your vulnerabilities, to understand exactly how to affect you. But when you say nothing, she has nothing to analyze. You become unreadable, unpredictable, a locked door she doesn't have the key for. And that creates something in her psychology that most men don't understand. Curiosity mixed with anxiety. Because humans are wired to make sense of the people around them, especially people they're emotionally invested in. When she can't decode you, when your silence offers no clues, no emotional leakage, no desperation to fill the space, her mind starts racing. What is he thinking? Why isn't he reacting? Did I lose him? Does he even care? Is he stronger than I thought? Have I misjudged him? Those questions consume her, not because you're playing games, but because you've refused to participate in hers. And in that refusal, you've become the most fascinating thing in her world. Nietzsche wrote about the Übermensch, the man who has transcended the need for external validation, who creates his own values instead of inheriting them from the herd, who stands alone in his truth without apology. And that concept applies perfectly here. The man who can remain silent while everyone around him demands he speak has achieved a level of self-mastery most men never reach. He's not silent because he has nothing to say. He's silent because he has nothing to prove. That distinction is everything. Let me show you what this looks like in real life. You're in a relationship. She starts an argument over something small. You forgot to text her back quickly enough. You made plans without consulting her. You said something she decided to take the wrong way. And she's upset, visibly upset, expecting you to scramble, to apologize, to explain, to fix it. The old you would have engaged immediately. You would have defended yourself, listed all the reasons you're not wrong, tried to make her see logic, gotten frustrated when she didn't. And the argument would have escalated until one of you gave in or both of you went to bed angry. But the man who understands silence responds differently. He listens, not to prepare his defense, but to observe. He watches her body language, her tone, her energy, and he recognizes it for what it is. A test. She's not upset about the text or the plans or the comment. She's checking to see if you're solid, if you'll crack under emotional pressure, if you need her approval to feel okay about yourself. And instead of speaking, instead of defending, instead of explaining, you do something radical. You simply look at her, calm, centered, unshaken, and you say nothing. Not out of spite, not to punish her, but because you genuinely have nothing to prove. Because her emotional state is hers to manage, not yours to fix. Because you know that engaging with the surface argument is a trap, and the only way to pass the test is to refuse to take it. At first, she might escalate. She might accuse you of not caring, of being cold, of shutting down. But you remain unmoved, not angry, not defensive, just still, like a mountain watching a storm pass over it. And then something happens. The storm stops. Because storms need fuel. They need reaction. They need someone to fight against. And when you give them nothing, when you become the immovable presence that refuses to participate, the energy has nowhere to go. She stops. She looks at you differently. And in that moment, the dynamic shifts permanently. Because she just learned something crucial. You cannot be controlled by her emotions. You cannot be manipulated by her tests. You exist in your own frame, and her approval or disapproval does not move you from it. That realization changes everything, not just in that moment, but in every moment that follows. And here's the cruelest part. Most men never learn this because they're terrified of silence. They treat silence like a void that must be filled. Like a gap in the conversation is a failure of connection. Like saying nothing means they don't care or aren't engaged or are somehow less than. So they fill every space with words. They narrate their feelings. They explain their intentions. They verbally process every thought that crosses their mind. And all of that talking is just noise. Because real communication isn't about the volume of words. It's about the quality of presence. And presence doesn't require explanation. It doesn't need justification. It simply is. Think about the most powerful men you've encountered in your life. Not the loudest, but the most powerful. The ones who commanded respect without demanding it. The ones whose approval you sought, even though they never seemed to need yours. The ones who could sit in a meeting, in a social gathering, in a tense situation, and say almost nothing. Yet everyone in the room was aware of them. Those men understood what most don't. Silence is not absence. Silence is the purest form of presence. Because when you're not filling the space with words, with explanations, with performances, people are forced to deal with the raw reality of who you are, not who you're trying to convince them you are, not the image you're projecting, but the unfiltered energy you carry. And if that energy is grounded, if it's centered, if it's completely unattached to the outcome of the interaction, it becomes magnetic. People lean in, they pay attention, they respect you without understanding why. That's not manipulation, that's authenticity. The kind of authenticity most men are too afraid to embody because it requires letting go of control, letting go of the need to manage others' perceptions, letting go of the safety net of verbal explanation. It requires trusting that who you are is enough, that your presence alone speaks louder than anything you could say. Nietzsche had a concept he called amor fati, love of fate. The idea that you embrace everything that happens to you, every challenge, every hardship, every moment of suffering, as necessary and even beautiful. You don't resist reality. You don't fight against what is. You accept it fully and move through it with grace. That same principle applies to dominance through silence. Most men resist uncomfortable moments. When tension arises, when conflict emerges, when she tests them, their instinct is to fix it immediately, to smooth it over, to restore comfort as quickly as possible, because discomfort feels like failure, but discomfort is where growth happens. And a man who can sit in discomfort without rushing to escape it develops a level of emotional resilience most men never access. When you can let a conversation end in tension and not lose sleep over it, you've mastered something powerful. When you can let her be upset and not scramble to fix her emotions, you've transcended the need to control outcomes. When you can hear an accusation and not feel compelled to defend yourself, you've reached a level of self-possession that most men only dream of. This is what Nietzsche meant by the will to power. Not power over others, but power over yourself. The ability to remain grounded in your truth regardless of external pressure. The strength to endure discomfort without flinching. The discipline to choose silence when every instinct screams at you to speak. That internal dominance translates to external dominance automatically, not because you're trying to dominate her, but because you've dominated the parts of yourself that used to make you controllable. You've killed the boy who needed validation, the boy who couldn't stand to be misunderstood, the boy who measured his worth by others' reactions to him. And in his place stands a man who knows his value doesn't fluctuate based on someone else's mood. A man who doesn't explain himself because he doesn't owe anyone an explanation. A man who can walk through life completely unbothered by the opinions of others because he's anchored in his own truth. That man doesn't dominate women through words. He dominates through sheer presence, through the unshakable certainty that radiates from someone who has nothing left to prove. Here's what men learn too late but never forget. The moment you stop seeking her approval is the moment she starts seeking yours. It's not a game. It's not a tactic. It's a fundamental shift in energy, because attraction isn't logical. It doesn't respond to fairness or effort or good intentions. It responds to polarity. To the masculine that is so grounded, so certain, so immovable that the feminine feels safe surrendering to it. But most men never establish that polarity because they're too busy trying to be agreeable, to be nice, to be understanding. They think if they just meet her halfway enough times, if they just compromise enough, if they just show her how reasonable and emotionally available they are, she'll love them more. And the opposite happens, because every compromise signals uncertainty. Every explanation signals insecurity. Every attempt to be understood signals a lack of self-possession. And the feminine doesn't trust uncertainty. It can't relax into insecurity. It can't surrender to a man who is seeking permission to exist. But when you stop explaining, when you stop defending, when you stop negotiating your worth, something primal shifts in her. She starts to feel something she hasn't felt with most men. The presence of someone who cannot be shaken. Someone who exists fully in his own frame. Someone who doesn't need her to complete him or validate him or approve of him. That presence is intoxicating. Not because it's cold or withholding, but because it's whole. It's the presence of a man who has already chosen himself, and if she's lucky, he might choose her too, but he doesn't need to. And that makes all the difference. So what does this actually look like in practice? It looks like the man who hears her criticism and doesn't immediately rush to correct her perception. He lets her have her opinion. He doesn't argue. He doesn't defend. He simply continues being who he is, unchanged by her assessment. It looks like the man who can end a conversation mid-sentence if the energy turns disrespectful. Not out of anger, but out of principle. He doesn't announce he's leaving. He doesn't explain why. He just removes himself from the space because his peace is non-negotiable. It looks like the man who can sit through dinner with her while she's upset about something and not feel compelled to fix it. He doesn't ask, "What's wrong?" 50 times. He doesn't beg her to talk to him. He just exists, calm and unbothered. knowing that her emotions are hers to process. It looks like the man who can be accused of being cold, distant, emotionally unavailable, and not scramble to prove otherwise, because he knows those accusations aren't about him. They're about her inability to control him, and he's okay with her discomfort because he's no longer willing to shrink himself to make others comfortable. This isn't cruelty. This isn't emotional abuse. This is boundaries. This is self-respect. This is the refusal to participate in dynamics that diminish you. And when you establish those boundaries through action, not words, when you demonstrate through silence that you will not be moved, women don't leave. They lean in. Because finally, they're in the presence of a man who isn't performing strength. He's embodying it. But here's the warning. This path is lonely at first, because when you stop explaining yourself, some people will misunderstand you. When you stop defending yourself, some people will believe the accusations. When you stop performing, some people will think you've changed, that you've become cold, that you're not the man they thought you were. And they're right. You're not. You're no longer the man who bends to keep the peace. You're no longer the man who apologizes for existing. You're no longer the man who measures his worth by others' approval. You've become something else, something most people don't recognize because most people have never seen it. A man who is complete within himself. That completeness is threatening to women who are used to manipulating men through emotional withdrawal. To friends who are used to you being agreeable. To a culture that tells men they need to be softer, more expressive, more available, more apologetic for their masculinity. But that completeness is also liberating. Because once you stop needing anyone's permission to be yourself, once you stop shrinking to fit into spaces that were never meant for you, once you stop explaining your worth to people who are determined to misunderstand you, you step into a level of freedom most men never experience. You become unshakable, not because nothing affects you, but because nothing moves you from your center. And that center, that unshakable core, is where real power lives. Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But I'd add this. The man who knows his worth can bear almost any accusation, almost any test, almost any silence. Because he's not looking for validation in her eyes. He's not seeking proof of his value in her reactions. He's not measuring his success by whether she stays or leaves, approves or disapproves, understands or misunderstands. He's measuring his success by one thing only: whether he remained true to himself. And when that becomes your standard, everything changes. You stop chasing. You stop explaining. You stop performing. You simply exist, fully and unapologetically, and let the world adjust to you instead of constantly adjusting yourself to fit the world. That existence, that refusal to negotiate your truth, is the most dominant force you can wield. Not because it controls others, but because it frees you from being controlled. So remember this: you don't dominate a woman by outsmarting her. You don't dominate her by having the perfect words, or the cleverest comebacks, or the most logical arguments. You dominate her by becoming the kind of man who doesn't need to dominate anyone. The kind of man who is so grounded in his own worth that her approval becomes irrelevant. The kind of man who can sit in silence while the world demands he speak and remain completely unbothered by the discomfort. That man doesn't explain himself because he has nothing to explain. He doesn't defend himself because he has nothing to defend. He doesn't chase because he has nothing to prove. He simply is, and that is enough. Not because someone told him it was, not because she validated it, but because he decided it, and that decision, that internal knowing, radiates from him in every interaction, every silence, every moment of stillness. That's the power Nietzsche was pointing to. The power of the man who has conquered himself so completely that no one else can. And once you become that man, you'll realize something profound. You were never trying to dominate her. You were trying to liberate yourself. And the moment you did, she felt it, and everything shifted. Not because you said a word, but because you didn't need to.